Good morning, everyone. Want to welcome you to our program. If you have a Bible or Bible app, turn over with us to Psalm 21. We're going to be over there in just a few minutes. Hope you're having a great Thursday morning. Sorry, this is a little bit later this morning. Had to do a little bit more prep before I got to this one. Psalm 20 and Psalm 21 are kind of different than the Psalms that we've looked at before. These Psalms are designed to be sung by the Jewish people on behalf of the king. And so when we read these songs, we need to kind of place ourselves in their mindset, in their culture, and kind of like you remember, they're being led by men like David and like Solomon. We also need to notice that this psalm was sung with the assumption that the king that was ruling at the time had a good heart, that he wanted the right things. I think perhaps one that would follow the example of David, like a man after God's own heart, a man that desired the same things that God wanted. And so one of the reasons we know that this psalm was written for the Jewish people to sing is the way that it's written here, but also the fact that as you look at Psalm 19, just back up to the last verse of Psalm 19. Psalm 19 says, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my redeemer." And then you get into Psalm 20 and you see, look there in verse 5. He says, "We will rejoice in your salvation. And in the name of our God, we will step up our banners. And may the Lord fulfill all your petitions." And so you just see words like us and we, and our, and those kinds of words. And so this Psalm 20 was written for the people. It was the people's prayer. But then we get to Psalm 21. So Psalm 20 is asking for God to answer, and it's like this prayer for God's protection for the king. But in Psalm 21, it's an acknowledgement of the answer of God's prayer. But before we look at the psalm, I think we need to notice that as you read at least the first 5 verses here, the first half of the psalm, there are several different requests. They use the word may. That word is used there 6 times here throughout this. And so these are requests of the people before God for the king. And you notice something different about this as a psalm. These are words that are not just written before God and for God, but these are words directed to the king, then to God. They're praying to God for the king. And it's like the people are informing the king about what they're requesting and desiring him to do for the king. And so in this first section, I just want you to notice in this first section, there are 6 requests concerning the king. May God answer the king in his distress. May he protect the king. May God send the king help and grant support. May God remember the king's sacrifices and accept those offerings. May God give the king what his heart's desire and his plans. May his plans succeed. May God grant all their requests. And so those are some of the requests. And we're going to go ahead and start digging into the psalm. Let's begin there in verse 1. We'll just read a little bit as we go through here. Verse 1 says, "May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble," or the day of your distress. And so the people are praying that God would answer the prayer of the king. But notice when he says, "in your day of trouble." And when might that be? Well, maybe they're losing a battle. Maybe there's this military campaign against him. But notice the last part of verse 1. He says, the second part of verse 1, he says, "May the name of God of Jacob defend you." And so the psalm is constantly referring to the name of God 3 times here in verse 1, verse 5, and verse 7. And each time it's kind of equated to the Lord himself. And so the name of the Lord is really just kind of a parallel to God's nature, his essence, who God is. And so may the Lord answer you, protect you, deliver you, lift you up in the day of trouble. Now, notice the psalm is in the name of the God of Jacob. He talks about that. He says, "May the name of the God of Jacob defend you." I want to kind of take your minds back to something that happened in Genesis 35. Remember, there's this violent attack in Shechem, And this attack was kind of instigated by Jacob's sons who were avenging the rape of their sister Dinah. And Jacob feared that that would come back on them, that it would stir up the people of these towns, these cities, and that they would go to war, and it would put his family at danger. And so all of this leads to him obeying God and leaving Shechem, and he goes to Bethel and he builds an altar. And so what Jacob is saying in this verse, it goes in verse 3, he says, "Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God who answers me in the day of my distress," or in the day of my trouble. And so Jacob says he's going to make an altar to the God who delivered him from the day of trouble. And here in the psalm, back in Psalm 20, the people are praying for God to answer the king in the day of his distress. And it's really appropriate for them to call him the God of Jacob. And so he is the God who he answers in the day of distress, just like he did with Jacob. And they're praying that he would do that, that God would do that with the king. Look at verse 2. He says, "May he send you help from the sanctuary and strengthen you out of Zion." And so how do they see the help of God coming to the king? He sends him help. But where does he send him help from? The sanctuary. See, the sanctuary was the temple. It was God's dwelling place. It was the special place where they had this connection with God. In Deuteronomy 12, verses 5 through 7, he says, "But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place." And God put his name in the sanctuary to dwell. And so the temple and the tabernacle before that became this contact point between God and man. It was this special place where people would go to pray to God. They would offer sacrifices to God. They would meditate and think about God. And properly, the people see the help of the Lord for the king coming where God dwells. And I understand we don't have a sanctuary in that sense today, but we do have Jesus. He is our connection between us and God. He is in heaven, but he came to earth, became man. He personified himself, God, as a human. He makes it possible for us to see God in kind of more concrete terms and identify with him. He really identifies himself as the tabernacle of God. He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. Look there in verse 3. He says, "May he remember all your offerings and accept your burnt offerings." And so, speaking of the sanctuary, the people would go to God and they would make offerings to the Lord. And the people are asking God to remember the king's offerings, that the offerings would be pleasing to God, that the offerings would seek his favor in battle. In 1 Samuel 13, remember, Saul was going to go to war with the Philistines, and and instead of waiting for Samuel, he rushes out and he does the sacrifices himself. And as wrong as that was for him to do, here's what Saul understood. He says, you don't go to battle without asking God's favor with sacrifices first. And so here the people's request was that God would find his sacrifices acceptable. Remember, God didn't find Saul's sacrifices acceptable, but they're praying that they would David or Solomon here. And just because you offer sacrifices, that doesn't mean that God has to find them acceptable or give a blessing. So even when we offer them, we still have to ask God to accept them, that God give a blessing to us for them. And so here's the first part of the request: answer the king, defend him in battle and in trouble, remember and accept his offerings. Look there in verse 4. He says, may he grant you according to your heart's desire and fulfill all your purpose. I think it's interesting that the people pray this. In order to pray that God would grant the king's heart's desire, you would have to have some kind of confidence that the king desired the right kinds of things. You'd have to assume that he is a good king, that he loves God, that that he has God's will in his heart. And then you pray that God would grant the king's heart's desire. And so when you love God, your heart will be filled with the will of God. Then you can pray that God will fill the desires of your heart. But if you don't love God, then your heart's not filled with the right kinds of things. Then you shouldn't be asking God to fulfill those desires. And what do you suppose the king's desire would be in the psalm here? Well, probably to win the battle for the Lord and to give the victory to the Lord. In fact, look at the next verse. Look at verse 5, the last verse of the section. They said, we will rejoice in your salvation in the name of our God. We will set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions. And so they're anticipating a victory for God's anointed. But who wins the victory? Well, God does. God gives them a victory. The salvation comes from God. God should get the credit. Even though the help from God comes out from the sanctuary to the king, they understand where it comes from. That comes from God who is in heaven. And so a good king would ask God, or would not set up a memorial for himself, and after they win the victory, but to set up banners for the name of the Lord. Remember, the king's help comes from the sanctuary. He's in his holy heaven. And that's where we get to that's the request portion. But we have the second portion. Look there in verse 6. He says, now I know that the Lord saves his anointed, and he will answer him from his holy heaven and with the saving strength of his right hand. So they said, I know the Lord saves his anointed, the king of Israel here, and he will answer him from his holy heaven. Again, like I just said, the assistance come from the sanctuary, but they know God's in heaven. They didn't think that God's dwelling was limited just to the temple, like like the Grecian and the Roman gods. They didn't think that God had to leave heaven to help the king. They understood that God had like dual residency, that he is dwelling everywhere, that he lives and he dwells in heaven, but he's also here. And the temple was just kind of an outpost of his dwelling for them. Almost in every psalm, we read about a king, but we need to connect this even deeper. Think of Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11. Think of who we need to connect this to. It says, who in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death and was heard because of his godly fear. Now, how was Jesus heard if he's suffering on the cross? Well, he cried out, he was heard, and he was delivered from death. The Father didn't leave him in the grave, but he was resurrected from the grave. And we need to have this confidence, this conviction that God does answer. I notice in the psalm, with the saving strength of his right hand. How strong is God's right hand? Well, tons of passages in the Bible talk about God's right hand, God's mighty hand, his outstretched arm. And it was by that arm that he delivered the Israelites from bondage in Egypt, that he defeated Pharaoh's army at the Red Sea, that he ran the enemies out of the land and he gave it to them, that he defeated the 185,000 soldiers army in one night, that he revealed Jesus and he resurrected him from the grave. It's the power of that right arm that he answers the prayer of the righteous. We know that God has the power. And so we have confidence that God will and that he can answer us. Think about Ephesians 3, verse 20. And what Paul says about God's answering our prayers, that he can do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. Think about look at verse 7, Psalm 27. He says, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. We need to have that kind of confidence in God. And then, when we have that kind of confidence, what do we not put our trust in? What do people often put their trust in, especially in battle? Well, weapons. Today there's a lot of stock in having the most updated kind of weapons. And back then it was bows, swords, chariots, horses. But it doesn't really matter what kind of weapons that we have. Like when God is on your side, it doesn't matter what kind of weapons. You didn't put your faith in weapons. You put your faith in God. It's like fighting, I don't know, It's like fighting people with Civil War cannons, and then you have heat-seeking missiles, right? Like, who's going to win? The one who has God on his side. That's not what you put your trust in. That's not the key to battle. Oh man, you see that all throughout the prophets. Studied through the book of Isaiah not that long ago. It's just the continual message because they were putting their trust in these horses and chariots, putting their trust in other nations when God's saying, hey, look, trust me. Like, I'm the one you need to put your trust in. But unfortunately, they had a king who was running out and seeking to have these alliances with places like Egypt and putting their trust in the strength of armies. And maybe this is a good point for us to make. Honestly, there are some Christians who put their trust in being an American first and then Christian second. How foolish is that? Like God is far greater. And the point for us is just trust God, right? Trust God. Look at verse 8. It says, they have bowed down and fallen, but we have risen and stand upright. Look at the contrast. Look at the difference results. And it's all based upon whether we trust in God or we trust in something else. Then look in verse 9. He says, save, Lord. May the King answer us when we call. And so we end the psalm the same way that we began the psalm. These are kind of the bookends. This is the way that the writers would show the point of emphasis here. It's calling on God to act. It's putting our trust in him and therefore turning to him and calling upon him. And so if we want a victory in this life, then we need to turn to the Lord. There's not a word in here about a battle strategy or using the right kind of weapons or certain alliances or living in certain kind of nation. It's all about the Lord. You know, it's got to be where we turn. We need to turn to him. We need to cry out to him. We need to put our trust in him. And we need to follow his will. We need to follow him, follow his ways. I love this psalm, and I think it's going to be really interesting to connect it next time with Psalm 21, which is kind of kind of just an acknowledgement that God answers their prayers. They put their trust in him. They cried out to him, and God answered their prayer. God answered their requests and granted them. I think that'll be really cool for us to do next time. I appreciate your time, appreciate your attention. And again, don't just, close your books, close your Bibles and put them away, but, study this, read it, think about it, meditate on it in the quiet times today. That's the point of each one of these. I appreciate your time, appreciate your attention. If you have any comments or anything, any thoughts that you have as you were reading through that psalm, please make sure to comment down below and I'll be able to interact with you. And that's one of the things that I love the most about this. So, and about this program. So appreciate your time. Appreciate your attention. Hey, Al. Yeah. Good to see you, bro. Good to see you, man. Glad that you were on here this morning. God never leaves us no matter what we have done. Yeah, God certainly continues to extend his presence to us. We've got to turn to him. We got to live his will and his way. But yes, God can forgive our sins, and we can continue to be in his presence. Amen. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your attention. Hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. God bless everybody.